Welcome. Today we're going to be doing geometry review. Our content objective is students will be able to calculate perimeter, area, surface area, circumference, and volume of different figures. Language objective is students will be able to discuss the steps required in finding the perimeter, area, surface area, circumference, and volume of different figures. Why am I learning this? Well, it's important for real world problems like how much water will fill a tank. So all of this is background knowledge. So first we're going to take care of area. How do we find area? Well, first we have to memorize the formula. In order to find the area, we need to do base times height. So here, typically base is towards the bottom. So in this case, I'm going to say the base is 27. So I'm going to write area equals 27 times the height, which is in this case a 19. So I'm going to put 19. Now it's just a matter of multiplying them together. I'm going to say 27 times 19 is 513. Now what's important is that you also write the units. Notice it's given in kilometers, so I'm going to go and put kilometers squared. And there's your first answer. Okay, now moving on to the next one. Same idea, it says find the area. First we need to recognize that this is a parallelogram. It's a quadrilateral, so it's going to follow the same formula, which is base times height. So first of all, a lot of students like to just pick numbers and multiply them together, and that's how they think they find area. So you need to be very careful. First, let's find the base. I'm going to say the base is right here, which is the same as this length here, which is 51 feet. So I'm going to say area is going to be 51 times the height. Well, be very careful. Let's think. What looks like the height of this shape? Do you think it's the 50 feet or do you think it's the 54 feet? Well, let's think. If I was measuring your height, would you stand up straight or would you lean? What would be a better representation of your height? Well, hopefully you stand up straight. So this would be the height. This is not the height. So we're going to write 50. So in order to find the area, we're just going to simply multiply 51 by 50, and you should end up with 2,550. And let's not forget our units. They did give us the units in terms of feet. So I'm going to go ahead and put feet squared. If you're wondering why we put squared and not just feet by itself, is because if you think about area, we are technically multiplying 51 feet times 50 feet. So notice we multiplied feet 2 times, and that's why it is squared. So this is our final answer. For number 3, it says now to find the perimeter and the area. First, let's take care of perimeter. Perimeter is basically the sum of all sides. What I like to think of it is, if I was running around the perimeter of a certain shape, I'd ask myself, how far did I run? So for example, if here is the shape, the black outline, this is the shape. If I was running this course, how far am I running? Well, let's see here. Let's see, from here to here, let me change the color there. From here to here, I am running 49 centimeters. So I'm going to start with that. The perimeter is going to be 49 plus. And I'm going to continue to run. I'm going to run down this way here, and that's going to be 47 centimeters. Continue going around this shape. This is basically the same length as this, so I'm going to go ahead and say that that's another 49. Plus the last, I'm almost there, this last side, which is also a 47. And that is all the sides. It was a 4-sided shape. That's why I do have 4 numbers to add up. So once you add all of those numbers up, you should end up with 192. And let's not forget our centimeters. Notice here, our centimeters aren't squared. Why? Because all we were doing was adding. When we're adding, it's not going to be squared. So the perimeter, I would say, is 192 centimeters. What about the area? Because they did ask for perimeter, but they also asked for area. Well, this is a quadrilateral, and for this we're just going to, once again, do base times height. Base is this right here. You generally think of the bottom, which is going to be the same thing as the 49 here. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the area is 49 centimeters. Let me just put the units in this one so you can see. Times the height. Once again, you got to be very careful. There's going to be some extra numbers that might not even get used. You need to decide which is the number you should use to represent whatever you need for the formula. For height, let's think. Is it going to be the 47 centimeters, which represents this right here? Or do you think it's the 42 centimeters that runs straight up and down? Hopefully your answer is 42 centimeters because the height is measured from top to bottom. We don't measure from a diagonal length. So here, the height of this shape, it is 42 centimeters tall. So let's multiply that by 42 centimeters. When you multiply that all out, you should end up with 2,058. So notice here, it's centimeters times centimeters, so that's why we have centimeters squared. And that is our answer. So moving on. Now it says find the area, but this time we don't have a parallelogram or a rectangle. This time we have a triangle. So there's a different formula to remember that. The formula for a triangle is 1/2 the base times height. So it looks very similar to the previous formula, except now they're adding in the 1/2. So let's get started. First, let's go ahead and start that by writing area equals 1/2. That's not going to change. So having that, I'm going to move on to the base. What is the base? Well, the base is right here. It's the bottom of the triangle. It is 8 kilometers. So let's go ahead and multiply by 8. The height. How tall is this triangle? Do you think it's the 9 kilometers or do you think it's the 8 kilometers? So hopefully that by this point you start to recognize that height is up and down, straight up and down. It's not slanted at all. So here I'm going to go ahead and say that the height is 8 kilometers. That's how tall, if you think about it, that is how tall this triangle is. So we're going to go ahead and write an 8 here. Now some of you may want to just go ahead and multiply across and say it's 1/2 times this 8 times 8, which is 64. But I'm going to suggest something. Instead, why don't you cross cancel? So for example, I notice a 2 and an 8 have a 2 in common. So I'm going to go ahead and cross cancel and say, okay, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 8 divided by 2 becomes a 4. If you want, you can go ahead and put this over a fraction so it's a little bit neater. And just go ahead and multiply. 1 times 4 times 8 is 32. 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1. So essentially it's going to be 32 kilometers squared. Now some of you probably didn't want to cross cancel, so real quick I'm just going to show you how else you could have done it. You could have also done this and said, okay, I know 8 times 8 is 64. So 1/2 times 64 will still give you 32 kilometers. The point of cross-canceling essentially is to get those numbers to be reduced a little bit so you're not working with such large numbers. So it's totally a preference. But I do highly suggest you start practicing cross-canceling because it does make life a little bit easier when you're working with smaller numbers. Okay, look, we have yet another triangle and it is asking us for area. So let's recall the formula for that is 1/2 base times height. So starting, I'm going to first write down area is going to equal 1/2. That value is not going to change. I'm going to first multiply by the base. So here, it really depends on how you look on the triangle. I can consider the 8 miles to be the base or the 18 miles to be the base. So it just depends on how you see it. Let's call 8 miles the base. So if 8 miles is the base, then obviously the height is going to have to be 18 miles. And the reason why I'm saying that is some of you could technically have looked at the image as if it was like this, and that would work as well. So here, we're going to go ahead and cross cancel. Again, this is definitely a skill you should practice and get comfortable with. If it helps you, write this as a fraction so you can see which one's my numerator, which one's my denominator. And the way we make whole numbers into fractions is simply put a wonder underneath it. So here I'm noticing a 2 and an 8 have a 2 in common that we can reduce it by. 2 divided by 2 is 1, 8 divided by 2 is 4. So now area is, all it is 1 times 4 times 18, which should give you 72. And 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1. So my final answer is going to be 72 miles squared. So hopefully you get to understand by this point, when you're looking for area, your units are always squared. Number 6, it says once again, find the area. So nothing's changed except now they're trying to be tricky. We're giving you multiple numbers, and it's going to be your job to figure out which number are the numbers that you need to figure out the area. So here, once again, we're just going to write down the formula. It's 1/2 base times height. So first, we're going to go ahead and start with area equals 1/2. We got to figure out the base. The base is generally the bottom of the triangle. So here, I'm going to say that it is 11 miles. Okay, notice it's not the whole distance, it's just, if you think about it, it's just this triangle here. Let me color it in for you so that you can kind of get a visual. This is the triangle we're looking at. So notice we're only looking at that red shaded area to figure out what that base is, which is 11 miles. Once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and write that in for 11 times the height. Again, be careful. Do you think the height is 24? That's straight up and down, or do you think it's 15? Or maybe do you think it's 30? Well, if I were to measure this triangle, I would measure it from here to here. And the only number that describes this distance is actually the 24 miles. So again, please make sure height is usually a straight up and down line. It's not slanted at all. So I'm going to go ahead and write that it's 24. Here, I'm going to check to see if I can cross cancel. I have a good feeling that I'm going to be able to do that. So what I'm going to do is turn these numbers into fractions simply by putting a 1 underneath it. Why did I have the feeling I was going to be able to cross cancel? Because I noticed a 2 and a 24 have a 2 in common. Notice the 2 and the 11, you can't reduce that, but the 24 you can. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 24 divided by 2 becomes a 12. So for the area, I'm going to multiply 1 times 11 times 12. 11 times 12 is just 132. The denominator is just 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1. So that's going to leave me with 132 miles. And hopefully you know it is squared, because again, with area, the units are squared. Okay, so now here it says find the perimeter and area. Now, please be mindful, this is not a triangle, this is not a rectangle. This here is what we call a trapezoid. A trapezoid has a very special formula, and you want to make sure you remember it. So first of all, let's find the perimeter. That's easy. The perimeter of any shape is always going to be the sum of all sides. So again, I like to think of it as, hey, if this was a track or maybe a map that I was walking around and I wanted to see how far I was, you're basically going to track how far it would be to go around the entire shape. So let's start here. If you imagine you're walking from here to here, you would have traveled 7 yards. Okay, then from there to there, you're going to have traveled 18 8/10 yards. Still going. Now from here to here, it is 21 yards. And then last but not least, we're almost there, it's 17.3 yards. So something to kind of be mindful about is, notice I never used the number 14 because I'm only focused on walking around this entire shape. Never did I have to cross this line. So please don't assume when you're finding perimeter or you're finding area, it's not about adding all the numbers that you see. It's not about multiplying all the numbers that you see. You have to be very mindful and check that you're doing it correctly. So real quick, I do want to quickly review how you're going to add numbers with decimals. First, you need to understand that with whole numbers, your decimals always belong at the end of the number. Okay, just like so. And if you want to remember, a good way to remember, is to think about money. If I were to look at something priced for $7, what would it look like? It would look like this. Notice here, the decimal belongs after the 7. Now think about it. Would $7 look like this? I hope not. Hopefully you understand that's technically 70 cents. So be very careful because lining up those decimals when we're adding is very important. So now that I know where the decimals are, let's go ahead and add all of them together. Here we have 7, we have 18 and 8/10. Notice I'm lining up those decimals. We have 21, and then we have 17 and 3/10. I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 as a placeholder here and add 8 plus 3 is 11. 1 plus 7 is 8. 8 plus 8 is 16. Plus 1 is 17. Plus 7 is 24. So let's put a 4 here. Carry the 2. I'm going to go out of order. 2 plus 2 is 4. Plus 1 is 5. Plus 1 is 6. So now simply bring down that decimal. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the perimeter of this trapezoid here is 64.1 yards, and that's it. Notice it's not squared, and the reason is because I was adding all of them. I wasn't multiplying. So there's my perimeter. But what about the area? Well, let's check that out. For me, the area of a trapezoid is very similar to the area of a triangle. Let me explain myself. Here is the formula for a triangle. Area equals 1/2 times base times height, right? Well, trapezoid is slightly different. Area for a trapezoid is 1/2. And instead of just one base, there's 2. If you're wondering what the bases are for a trapezoid, it's basically the 2 lines that never intersect. They are parallel to one another. Okay, so these 2 lines are parallel. Notice, some of you may say, well, what about the other 2? Are they parallel? Well, let's take a look. If you look here, these lines are definitely not parallel. If we were to extend these on forever, they will eventually intersect. So the base is important for you to understand. They are the lines that are parallel to one another. So here, the base is a 7 and a 21. So with a trapezoid, you're not using just one base. Your base is composed of 2 lines. So there's a base 1, and you have to add that to a base 2. But just like a triangle, you're still going to multiply by height. So the true difference is we're changing the base to base 1 plus base 2. It's very similar to the area of a triangle. Okay, so now that we have that, let me clean it up a bit. And let's go ahead and get to work. To find the area of this trapezoid, I'm going to do 1/2 times the base. And again, the base are the lines that are parallel to one another. So here, 7 and 21 are parallel. So I'm going to go ahead and write 7 plus 21. Then we're just going to go ahead and multiply by the height. Height is basically how tall it is. Okay, so here it is this tall. What value tells me the height of this shape? So you got to be careful because a lot of students kind of pick and choose the numbers that they want. It is very purposeful. This is not the height. This is slanted. This is also slanted. When you're looking for a height, it's usually straight up and down. So here the height I'm going to say is 14 yards. So let's write that in. Times 14. So at this stage, you can go ahead and simplify what you have. So I'm going to write area equals 1/2. I'm going to simplify what's inside the parentheses first because that's what order of operation tells me to do. 7 plus 21 is 28. Then I'm going to go ahead and multiply by 14. Now at this stage, it's extremely helpful if you can cross-cancel because again, cross-canceling will shrink numbers to be a little bit more bearable. So here you can cross-cancel with 28 or you can cross-cancel with 14. 14 I know right off the top of my head, so I'm going to go for that one. 2 divided by 2 becomes a 1. 14 divided by 2 becomes a 7. Here, note you could have cross-reduced with 28 as well. I just chose 14 because I know what 14 divided by 2 is off the top of my head. So here we're going to have area equals, and for some of you it may be helpful for you to write it as a fraction like so. So our numerator is going to be 28 times 7. If you do that, you should end up with 196. 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1. So I'm left with 196 yards, and because it's area, it is squared. Why is it squared? Because once again, this here would have ended up in yards, 28 yards. This would have ended up with 14 yards. Yards times yards is squared. Moving on to number 8, it says find the area. Guess what? This is again a trapezoid. Okay, how can you tell if something is a trapezoid? Well, it's going to have 4 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. And what's special about a trapezoid is it only has one set of parallel lines. And you're going to notice here there is a set of parallel lines, but there's only one set. Why? Because these lines are not parallel. How would you know? If you were to extend these forever, they would eventually intersect. So those are not parallel at all. So, now that I know it's a trapezoid, I know what the formula is. Again, it's very similar to a triangle. Area is 1/2 base, except with a trapezoid, the base is made up of base 1 and base 2. It's the lines that are parallel. And then you can go ahead and multiply it by the height. Let's clean that up a bit. There we go. So let's go ahead and fill this in. Area equals 1/2 times the 2 bases added together. And again, your base is going to be the lines that are parallel. So notice here the 22 meters and the 8 meters are parallel. They will never intersect. So I'm going to go ahead and add those. 8 plus 22. But then we're going to multiply by the height. I know this is going to be confusing for some because usually you think of, okay, well, it's how tall the shape is. And you're thinking, well, it's 22 meters, right? The answer is no. The 22 is actually representing the base. So if you want to, you can kind of imagine the shape as if it was drawn like this. So technically, this is your height. Okay, so if I look at it here, the actual height will then be 9 meters. So it's basically a shape that's been rotated. So be very careful. You shouldn't be using a number for a base and a height at the same time. So here I'm going to say the height is 9 meters. And I'm just going to simplify what I have. So here, area equals 1/2. We're going to go ahead and simplify in the parentheses here. 8 plus 22 is 30. And go ahead and multiply by 9. And here, at this point, we can go ahead and cross cancel. I'm noticing a 2 and 30 do have a 2 in common, so I'm able to cross cancel there. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 30 divided by 2 is 15. So now area is basically left with 1 times 15 times 9. That's going to leave me with 135 meters, and you guessed it, it should be squared. Okay, so moving on. As for number 9, it says find the volume. Well, there's another formula for that. With the volume, it's very important to know a very basic formula. Why? Because this formula will translate very well for you when you go to 8th grade because it's going to work for the shapes that you learn in 8th grade as well. So the important thing for volume is not remembering base times height times width and all that good stuff. Instead, the best formula for finding volume is going to be capital B times H. Or you're going to hear it in 8th grade as volume equals B times the altitude. Okay, it looks like volt. But you're probably wondering, what's a capital B? Is that the same as a lowercase b? The answer is no. The capital B represents the base of the shape. Okay, the base of the shape. The base is going to be a shape that is parallel to another end. Okay, so this is what you're going to learn in 8th grade, so quick preview, kind of like a cylinder. Your base is going to be a circle because there's two of them and they're parallel to one another. So in this case, the base could be referred to as this rectangle here. Okay? And then this fancy word, altitude, is just another word for height. Okay? We generally use altitude for good reasons, and you'll learn a little more of that when you're in 8th grade, but for now, we can go ahead and use height. Okay, so now that we know that, let's go ahead and fill in our information. The volume is going to be the area of the base. Well, the base is a rectangle, either one you look at. They are exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and say, since it's a rectangle, I'm going to do base times height. So this here is going to be 11 times the height, which is 12. And I know it looks a little misleading, but technically this is just a rectangle. It's 11 here and 12 here. That's how I got my values. Now we're going to multiply by the height, which is, again, another word for that could be altitude. So the height of this is 15 feet. So let's multiply by 15. So at this point, it's just a matter of multiplying all of these numbers together to find the volume. So here I'm going to say the volume is 1,980. But here, what should I write? It's going to be feet. Should it be feet squared, or is it something else? Well, guess what? With volume, the feet is going to be cubed. Why, you might ask? Well, here, if you actually wrote in the units, you would have found that you'd have to multiply by 11 feet times 12 feet times 15 feet. You would have noticed that you'd have to multiply by feet 3 times, and that's why it's cubed. So that is your answer.